Luke's Rising. I'm Rachel Branch, and I am so delighted once again that my guest on this program is Mr. H. John Fisher, the Fair Housing Manager of Wayfinders in Springfield. And he brings always such a wealth of information and background, and his background and experience are substantial in housing and solving housing problems. Right now, I think the housing crisis is extremely perilous, and the obstacles facing our citizens, especially the elderly and disabled, seem unconscionable to me, truly unacceptable, and actually nearly unbelievable. Welcome, John. Once
Always
again.
a pleasure to be here.
Yes.
Actually, when you talk about me, I don't know if it's quite fair. I might have a good background in housing. Solving, unfortunately, I think that's a little of what we're talking about. Solving the problems is a little bit harder for me to say I can do something about sometimes. We do what we can, but there's a huge problem.
A part of solving is trying to solve.
Yes.
So I'll give you that one,
Yes.
John.
I try.
And the fact that you're in the field and are a person who cares. And that's one of the things that is very hard, particularly for me these days, finding it very difficult with complaints and watching people with complaints, getting people in government or elected officials to respond. I'm really appalled in not just the area of housing, but in many areas, the work that is not being done for the disabled, the elderly, the vulnerable, the homeless, my goodness. And I can't even fathom how we can have homeless people in the United States or hungry people, and I know I've said that on other programs.
And it's still true. I think there are systems in place. There are people, some of whom, almost all of whom, have basically good intentions, but the whole thing. But in spite of all that, the system really doesn't really work the way it should, and people can fall through the cracks. The people who are hired to do the job, if you will, to deal with some of these problems don't necessarily always understand both the depths of the problems and also how in some ways, I guess the thing is that it's very much like perhaps dealing with the system is a little bit like dealing with the so-called voice jail, voicemail situation, that if it is exactly what the programming has set it to be, it works fine. But for 90% of the calls, everybody's a little bit different people in different places, and it just breaks down. And so you end up, listening to a recorded message for an hour and a half before you get somebody to talk to. The intent might have been to make it easier. The effect makes it harder. And again, that there are human beings who are implementing the system, and sometimes they don't really understand what the laws are, what the regulations are, and often when somebody tries to do their rights, you end up with a situation where someone feels personally somewhat attacked. And so rather than getting helpful, they get defensive, and then it just starts to break down.
I think what this reminds me is of our healthcare system also. This is a structural, systemic problem that is not being dealt with. And of course, the correlation between the money that we have for wars and war profiteering could solve these problems. And yes, when you talk about a person feeling attacked, those are the people that are on the front lines that don't have the power of enforcement and don't have the power of accountability. Would you like to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I mean, and again, as I say, I think my point was really that there are a set of rules which are meant to be guidance, which are meant to help someone. But the problem is they can sort of then become rather than a means of helping someone, they become a straitjacket. They're, someone kind of unthinkingly applies them or doesn't realize this is a situation in which an exception needs to be made. That, again, for disabilities, for example, someone who's disabled, there's a requirement of making sort of a reasonable accommodation, and that reasonable accommodation really needs to be made unless, and this is again just the way it's stated, unless it places an undue financial or administrative burden, which is a very kind of perhaps a fuzzy word, but really it means that there has to be a very, very good reason why you don't make that exception, why you don't work with somebody over it. And rather than saying, this is the rule, this is what I'm going to do, or this is, this is what I was told was the way I had to run things, so that people become rigid and defensive. And, that really becomes a major flaw in the system. And the people who are asking for help don't really necessarily know what their rights are, or how at least in theory, how extensive those rights are. That, as I say, again, the disabled person who can't find a unit, or who, whatever the adjustment they may need where they're living, that person doesn't necessarily know how powerful the laws are that should be protecting them. And the person who's supposed to be implementing that doesn't necessarily know or doesn't appreciate the fact how extensive the request is, the disabled person's potential rights are in these things. The basic thing is, again, if you need a special, again, request for whatever, an accessible apartment, for any number of things having to do with your disability, that really is supposed to be granted unless, again, it places an undue financial or administrative burden, which really is a very high standard. And if someone simply says, no, we can't do that, that shouldn't be the end of it. At that point, there needs to be, if you will, a time where everyone sits down together and says, or really tries to look at the problem together. What is it? What's the problem? What do you need? Okay, this might not be possible. So what can we do to accomplish the same thing? How can we work this out? And only if there really is no other way of doing it, can somebody end up saying no to those kind of requests.
The phrase you used is a financial burden.
Undue financial or administrative
and
burden.
I hear that phrase, and I wonder if that's a catch-all, so managers and owners don't have to do something. Those phrases.
But that's exactly the way it's taking it the wrong way. It's flipping it on its head. Again, the burden of proof, if you will, is on the manager, on the individual who's being asked for the service, not the one who is asking for it. I mean, examples are if you had a single a single property, let's say a 3-story wood frame building that's valued at maybe $400,000 or something like that, and someone wanted an elevator put in the top floor. That's going to cost more than the building.
Oh, yes.
That's obviously for them an undue burden. If you're dealing with a large housing authority or something like that, that might, in fact, not be an undue financial burden. So it has to do with what are the really resources of the one being asked for it, and how realistic is it. And even if it's not realistic to put in that elevator, it isn't over yet. It's then really supposed to be sitting down together and having the person, in this case, say the manager or what have you, the landlord, think, so what can we do? What else can we do? How else can we accomplish what you need? We can't do the elevator, but is there a way, can we get you into a first floor unit?
Yes.
And then now we can put in a ramp, now we can put in grab bars, now we can widen. This no longer becomes an undue burden. Again, the companion animal, that somebody has the right, if they have an emotional problem,
Yeah.
to have a companion animal. And technically, that's not really a pet.
No.
But again, so what does that mean? The undue burden might be that the person who owns the building doesn't have to walk the dog, doesn't have to clean up after it, let's say if it's a dog. But it doesn't mean, no, we can't do this, we have a no pets policy, or no, we can't afford that. You really have to sit down and essentially show that it isn't really an undue burden before you could really consider the matter resolved.
Can that be excluded in a, say, a subsidized housing situation where that is excluded ahead of time to say no pets allowed, not even service animals? Is that considered discrimination?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no pets allowed, absolutely legitimate. But again, you run into different things. There are service animals, seeing eye dog, or, and again, really in Massachusetts is a dog that's trained to bring things to you or something like that. Like as I say, that's not a pet. That's an appliance.
And there are also dogs that are used for emotional, like
Support animals, yeah. They're technically,
support
they're not
animals.
service animals, but they are animals that are providing a necessary service. The reasonable accommodation is to make that exception. No pets is a legitimate rule to have, perhaps, but therefore saying that you can't have something that really meets your disability, your particular problem. No,
It has to be allowed?
It has to be allowed.
Yes, which it ought to.
Yeah, and
Also-
again, it's sometimes seen, I mean, there have been, people think of it as dogs, but there have been emotional support turkeys, and on what, at least on the surface, feels fairly
Bird.
ridiculous. But nonetheless, it's, to the individual, this is something that's very, very important.
It's a health companion.
It's part of their health and well-being. It's like saying, no, you can't use a walker, or no, you can't take your medication, or whatever it might be.
One of the things, and playing a little devil's advocate here, John.
Feel free.
One of the things that I'm concerned watching and seeing is residents who are afraid to come forward.
Yeah.
And retaliation, I've observed, is huge. And that is a problem that needs to be solved. I don't know what the answer to it is, but
I mean, I think it needs to be, again, people can get representation. It still is, I mean, I suppose the analogy I could use is police brutality is illegal. Yeah, so is robbing banks, but it happens. Retaliation is illegal. Obviously, it happens. If it becomes really, on the one hand, it may just simply be somebody is stiff, hostile to the person who asked for it whenever they come in. It makes them feel uncomfortable. That's hard to deal with. But if there's really something of just, it starts to get to the point of being harassment, that's something that you can take legal action against.
Yep.
And there is help. In the western part of the state, for example, community legal aid is overworked and perhaps hard to get a hold of sometimes, but they are there if somebody does need assistance. Again, if you reach out to me at Wayfinders, you may not be able to get a hold of me, but I do return my phone calls, as you know. And and I or one of my people can at least explain what your rights are and give you some suggestions about where to go if you feel your rights are being violated.
of course, in my experience, I think also people need to know that if you can't get assistance at one place, keep going.
And keep trying.
And go
Become a
every
pain in the
avenue you
neck.
can.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
And that's part of a solution too,
Yeah.
is to say, okay, if you don't stop here, that might be a wonderful thing. I know the Fair Housing and Civil Rights Conference is coming up again. What a nice segue that turned out to
Yes,
be.
yes, it is.
To discuss who do you keep going to when you can't get assistance?
Yeah. Anybody and everybody. I mean, again, ask to speak to somebody's supervisor if they're they're not doing it. And again, we both know, honestly speaking, that it isn't always easy. The system doesn't always work. But if you don't try and you don't stay at it, it's not going to, it probably won't work for you. And, you know, that's, and I think, again, particularly with people who are disabled, sometimes with older people, I guess I can say that because I would fit into the
Elders
category.
are elders.
Calendar's got me on that one anyway.
I call
But-
them seasoned citizens.
Yes.
Our seasoned citizens.
Right.
Yeah.
But basically, there's a tendency of not wanting to make waves. Sometimes you need to make waves. And as I say, you probably are going to be perceived in some ways as a troublemaker for having done that. Okay, so be it. But it's still, in a sense, you're not just doing it for yourself, you're doing it for everybody else too. Because it sort of sets the precedent, it opens the door, and sometimes reminds people. One of the things when people are they're brought, an action is taken against them with the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination, MCAD. Again, this is easy, Google it if you want to know how to find it. But when an action is taken with them and the finding is in their favor, very often the offender, one of the things they're told to do is to get fair housing training. Because, again, really what people's rights, both fair housing rights and also landlord-tenant rights, are really much more, much larger in scope and much more protective than most people understand that they are, and the responsibility to comply with them is there. Again, the other analogy I use is if someone's driving on the Massachusetts Turnpike, the speed limit is 65 miles an hour. Does that mean everyone's going 65? No, myself included, to be honest. But the point is that I'm talking about things as they should be, the rules as they should be. I'm not naive enough to think that, therefore, that's the reality. It's not. And again, there are no easy answers on that.
I think one of the things I'd interject is to say, when you're doing this, if you do stand up and speak out, do some self-care and try to look at the complaint and what you're doing in just what you've said, that it affects many people, to look at it as a journey and see how far you can get.
Yes.
And there could be extraordinary feedback from people that know you are helping in this way. That's one of the reasons I'm so delighted that you continue to come on Solutions Rising, because you always bring information that's pertinent to what people are living in their everyday lives. And one of those things, I think, Suffolk Law School just recently had a wonderful conference, and one of the things that they talked about was when you're building a complaint, damages, and they have sheets that you could get to fill out to know what the damages are to the specifics of what's happened to you as the result of housing problems. And of course, I'll segue right.
Yes, yeah, and in fact, damages are important for a couple of reasons. To some extent, there is at least the idea of at least partially trying to make the person whole.
Yes.
But the other part of it is also that the damages are how it becomes real, not just for the individual who action is being taken against, who's being sued or is being requested, but also for kind of everybody else who does that or potentially does that, or sometimes even thinks, would have thought that the person who got sued was perfectly okay and within their rights of doing what they did. And they're going to be more likely to notice, wait a minute, maybe this wasn't within somebody's rights if they find out that they got sued. There's a deterrent effect.
Yes, a deterrent, and also can lead to maybe resolving the problem before ever getting to a trial state.
Yes.
Mediation or the perpetrator knowing that they have done this and they need to fix it. And also, the laws, when you go that far on retaliation, really have a significant effect on the victim being protected. So,
Well, one of the things that, I mean, if you talk about mediation, the concept behind it is interest-based negotiation. And sometimes early on, people, actually both the person asking for the accommodation, but also the person who may be denying it, each kind of has a solution,
Yeah.
and they start to argue from their solution. It's like they don't want to give ground,
Yep.
as opposed to trying to strip away. This is the old mediation thing. You try to strip away the whatever someone's coming in to argue about, and really try to clarify what are the interests for everybody involved, what's needed by everybody involved, and so it becomes interest-based negotiation. Once you clarify this is the real problem. Now, how do we solve this together? That's what should be happening.
it should be, and I think the complainant also
Yeah.
has to be very careful that before they say yes to that, that the resolution might be weighed on the side of the person, the landlord or the owner, to be very careful accepting that, because you might pursue a legal path right to trial.
Yeah, and I see this very often in cases, just landlord-tenant situations that have gone wrong. Okay, so what went wrong? Well, in some cases, there was an attempt at resolving it, but essentially the solution became largely what, let's say, the landlord wanted. And the landlord wasn't really being realistic about what the tenant could do. So you end up having these cases where people will kind of go to court and then they'll make a solution before it even gets to the judge or gets to mediation. And that solution is whatever, I'll pay you 1.5 times a month's rent for the next 3 months, and that'll catch us up. Except for the fact that their financial situation hasn't really changed.
Yeah.
So that they couldn't afford it before, they can't afford it then. But it feels like at the time, oh good, the problem's resolved, there's been a solution, but they've each set themselves up to fail. The landlord set an impossible task for the tenant, even though it would be great if the tenant could do it as far as the landlord's concerned. And the tenant has agreed to this because, oh good, now I'm not going to be taken to court, now I'm not going to whatever. And of course, 3 months down the road, since it never was a realistic solution, now you've got a situation where everybody is angry at everybody else and feels they dealt in bad faith.
Yeah. I think one of the things that probably residents don't realize is it's important to do a chronology. It's important to keep your documentation.
Yes.
It's important to have, yourself in a position of putting together, even if you don't file a complaint, as much substance of background and documentation and times and what has happened, and then get to know the law. And damages are not just monetary. We're talking about emotional damage.
Yes.
We're talking about fear in your home damages. So those are all kinds of things, and that's a good way to start a complaint, is to have all those ingredients to put in the substance of what needs to be done to correct.
Yeah. Well, this is, my other hat has to do with applied neuroscience and so forth. I mean, it's very interesting because when you image someone's brain, the same areas that light up for physical pain light up for emotional pain. The fact that language always talks about, you hurt me by doing this to me. And that in fact, it is, functionally speaking, much the same thing, does much the same damage, to somebody's brain, to somebody's whole body, and so forth. So when you say damages are real.
Yes,
Damages
very
are real. Just one thing real quickly I wanted to mention too that was interesting, we talked about a little bit beforehand, is it's probably worth, if you're at all interested, going on the internet and seeing it's the new concept of the HUD's new proposed regulations
Oh, yes.
about affirmatively furthering fair housing. Because these are very similar to they had something of that sort before. During the last administration, it was somewhat cut back, and so now they're trying to come forward again. And really, the quickest way I could do that is everyone in the housing business, if you will, has a task of complying with fair housing. But it's not just, again, kind of another analogy, if you want to get in, it's not necessarily just simply do no wrong. That really the implicit thing is that you have to affirmatively step past that. And you know, if you want to use a kind of a religious thing, it's not just sins of commission, it's also sins of omission, failing to do the right thing. And that this is already what's required, but I think it's going to become even more so once these new regulations come into
yes, and if you look up affirmatively furthering fair housing or HUD, Google, you should be able to find it. It's quite a statement, and we'll be watching this and talking about it in our next program. And very quickly, as we're coming to the end, I'm going to segue again into April
11th through 13th.
is going to be the Fair Housing Civil Rights Conference.
Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
Is it going to be in person, some of it?
Some of it will be this time. We're back to that. After 3, it's kind of exciting.
That's wonderful.
You know, again, obviously, COVID is still with us. Some of the other things are still with us. We will ask people to use, you know, only to come if they're, you know, they've been properly tested, and you know, masks will be optional and so forth.
And that's like 15 minutes thing. You can do it right at home.
Oh, yeah.
It'd be there. And masking, I think, and social distancing will be important.
Yes.
What is the conference highlighting? I'm getting really close to
I
the
know,
end
we're
right here.
running out.
We're going
really
to do
quickly,
this.
the same thing as usual. It's a whole range of fair housing, civil rights issues. There will be keynote speakers. One of them would be Demetria McCain from HUD. One of them will be, you know,
well, we're going to do a program
We're going to do a
on
whole
this.
program that anyway.
It's-
Yeah, but anyway, there will be a whole series of workshops. The first day will be in person. It'll be streamed live. The next 2 days will be only virtual.
Oh, wonderful. And of course, we will set up our next program before you leave today. And once again, I have to thank you so much, John. It's just really important that you come and do these programs with me. And if each one of us picked up one problem and solved it, imagine the incredible view we would all have of solutions rising. Please be part of the solution, and you can email me or you can contact John Fisher if you have additional questions or something you would like to ask on our next program. Thank you very much. Thank you, John.
My pleasure as always, Rachel.